The enemy Richard Nixon had taken on was the anti-war movement, which he felt was hamstringing his conduct of the Vietnam War.
Nixon used the apparatus, as we now know, of the government to discredit, use all of the intelligence gathering techniques against this anti-war movement. The embodiment of it was Daniel Ellsberg, who provided the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times and the Washington Post.
As it would later be revealed, the plumbers broke into the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist to find damaging evidence against him. Meanwhile, the White House anger at the press just kept growing.
Nixon felt that the press was on the side of the anti-Vietnam people. So they started tapping the telephones of reporters. Absolutely outrageous. Can you imagine that coming out today?
But things were still relatively under control. That would end before long.
One afternoon, a man who had been assigned to my staff came eye wide into my office and said, "John, Chuck Colson wants me to firebomb the Brookings Institute." And I said, "You've got to be kidding." And I said, "What for?" He said, "Well, there's some documents that they think are connected with the Pentagon Papers, and they want me to go in there, firebomb the place, and then make a burglary." I said, "That's crazy." He said, "I know it's crazy."
But even as the administration was going after its enemies, it was achieving its greatest successes. First, there was the remarkable visit to China, a nation Nixon had long painted as America's implacable foe. In February of 1972, Richard Nixon met with, drank with, and dined with the leaders of the world's most populous communist nation. He would later regard the trip as the high point of his presidency, and it was met with near universal acclaim. Then, in May of 1972, Richard Nixon went to the Soviet Union and signed a strategic arms limitation treaty, a first big step toward taming the arms race between the superpowers. It was part of a policy to warm relations with a land Nixon had always seen as profoundly evil. And with détente, a backing away from Cold War brinksmanship, the whole world breathed easier. In his policy toward the Soviets and China, Nixon gained two ends. On its own, the policy advanced Richard Nixon's goal of world peace, but it was also geopolitics at its most sophisticated. Fearful of each other, both Russia and China were more than ready to make America an ally.
I think that the opening of China and the establishment of détente with the Soviet Union was, first of all, an act of political courage on Nixon's part. It was very high-risk politics, and it was the product of very hard thinking on Nixon's part about the shape of the world and the shape of the United States and where we are in the world and what we need to do and what kind of world do we want 5 and 10 and 20 years from now.
It was Richard Nixon's past that made it all possible.
Only Nixon could have led to the relationship with China. That's because he was one of those who complained bitterly about who lost China, and he had the strong anti-communist reputation. So he was able to bring his constituency, which trusted him as they would nobody else, on the subject of China. You know, if Nixon says it's all right on this one, you know, it's got to be all right.
But as in so much of Richard Nixon's career, success was shadowed by failure, high purpose by low politics. On the very night he was toasting Leonid Brezhnev, 5,000 miles away, a small group of operatives were breaking into the Democratic headquarters in Washington. They'd get away with it this time, but a month later, it would be different.
The Democratic National Committee is trying to solve a spy mystery. It began before dawn Saturday when 5 intruders were captured by police inside the offices of the committee in Washington. The 5 men carried cameras and apparently had planted electronic bugs. One of them had several crisp new $100 bills in his pocket. The Democrats say they have no idea who would want to spy on them.
June 17th, 1972, the event that would begin what would forever after be known as Watergate took place when 5 men were arrested after breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex. It wasn't long before the connection to at least somebody in the White House staff became apparent.
One of the things they seized when they arrested him was a telephone book which had the White House number and Chuck Colson's extension. I mean, that took 24 hours. It went to the White House overnight.
I willingly got involved in the cover-up, and as the weeks went by, I soon became, in essence, the desk officer of the cover-up. I was the man in the middle. I was, going over to the re-election committee and finding out what they were doing and coming back and telling my superiors at the White House what they were doing and trying to make sure that nothing fell apart before the election.
Mr. Nixon, Did you know about the burglary of our Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate? Did you know, Mr. Nixon?
But in the early days, the possibility that the president would one day be implicated in the affair was unimaginable.
Neither the president, obviously, or anybody in the White House, or anybody in authority in any of the committees working for the re-election of the president have any responsibility for it, and therefore there's no reason why it should be a matter of concern to the American public, and it certainly won't hurt the president's re-election.
As the 1972 election neared, Richard Nixon seemed to have it in a lock. Most Americans believed he was doing all he could to end the war in Vietnam as quickly and as responsibly as possible. The signing of the SALT agreement with the Soviets, détente, and the spectacular mission to China had won him enormous support, including grudging applause from his harshest critics. If Richard Nixon ran a subdued campaign in 1968, in the 1972 campaign he was virtually invisible. His plan was to emerge from the White House only in the closing weeks. As it happened, the victory over liberal Senator George McGovern was nothing less than mammoth. It was unprecedented. Richard Nixon carried every single state in the Union save Massachusetts. But if he was overjoyed at his re-election, he didn't show it.
Nixon had the problem of being a sore winner. He had a lot to do in 1973. He won in a landslide, and now he was going to make some real changes.
Haldeman sent a bulletin around asking everybody for their resignation, the White House staff, as he wanted to clean house, but it wasn't done very beautifully. It was done rather harshly.
Throughout the first administration, the terrible story of Vietnam had continued. Hundreds of thousands of American troops had been withdrawn, but thousands of Americans continued to die there. At last, after so many false starts, the peace process succeeded. On January 27th of 1973, a ceasefire was signed at the peace talks in Paris. One of America's saddest episodes was over, and Richard Nixon's earlier pledge to end it had finally been redeemed.
It is necessary to recognize that he got us out of Vietnam, which was something that his predecessors hadn't been able to do, and he got us out without setting off something akin to a civil war here in the United States. That is to say, Nixon had a lot of pressures on him. The anti-war movement may have been capturing the television camera's attention, but there were an awful lot of people in this country who wanted victory in Vietnam. I think the worst thing you can say against Richard Nixon is that almost half of the names on the Vietnam Wall are the names of young men who died when he was the commander-in-chief after he decided this war is unwinnable. It was the longest and costliest retreat in our history.
Watergate is defined, I noticed in the dictionaries now, as abuse of high office occurring during the presidency of Richard Nixon.
Watergate may be in the dictionary today, but the story was still a minor one when Richard Nixon's second term began in 1973. Stunning successes in China and the Soviet Union and the impending end of Vietnam had given Richard Nixon a landslide victory and pointed to a glorious second term.
As we meet here today, we stand on the threshold of a new era of peace in the world.
But even in his triumphant moment, Richard Nixon's presidency had been fatally compromised. And within 18 months, revelations of extensive illegal activities, including obstruction of justice, perjury, and the payment of hush money, would bring down a president for the first time in history.
I condemn any attempts to cover up in this case, no matter who is involved.
There was a cover-up from day one. Now, what I don't think anyone really ever did and sat around and planned was how to obstruct justice. That never happened. What happened is everybody just sort of slid into this terrible quagmire because of the problems that Liddy and his men had created.
Just before the inauguration, the Watergate burglars had appeared in federal court before a man who would prove to be one of the president's most dogged opponents, Judge John Sirica. 2 weeks after the inauguration, the Watergate story began to gain momentum.
The Senate tonight voted 77-0 to establish a select committee to investigate alleged political espionage in last year's election campaign. That includes the Watergate bugging case. The committee will be headed by North Carolina Democrat Sam Ervin.
On March 21st, 1973, John Dean warned the president the cover-up was getting out of hand. It would take a lot of money to keep the Watergate burglars quiet.
I tried to convince the president, as the tapes show. I told him at one point, you know, there's a cancer growing on the presidency. And if I assumed that he would take the scalpel out quickly and cut it off. And he didn't. To the contrary.
People say, geez, if he'd have just come out and said, but I'm going to punish the guys who did it and we're going to clean up the operation around here. If he'd have done that, the press and Judge Sirica would have wanted to know, what else have you guys been up to? And what else have they been up to? They'd broken into Dr. Fielding's office out in California to try to get some goods on Daniel Ellsberg. What else had they been up to? They had been bugging foreign embassies. What else had they been up to? They had been bugging American newspaper reporters. What else had they been up to? They had been running these dirty trick operations. In other words, to admit that those were my guys and they did it and I'm the responsible party, opened Nixon to all of the crimes that had been taking place in his first administration.
The president now believes, through a subsequent investigation, that his previous Watergate investigation, conducted by John Dean, was full of holes.
John Dean began to feel he was being set up to take the fall. His lawyers began meeting with federal prosecutors to secure the best deal if and when he went public with what he knew. Jeb Stuart Magruder, the deputy head of President Nixon's 1972 re-election committee, also met with prosecutors and told them about the meeting the previous June when the Watergate break-in was planned.
Sources say that Magruder has told federal investigators that he attended a meeting in the office of then Attorney General John Mitchell in February of last year, where he says the Watergate break-in was plotted by Mitchell, G. Gordon Liddy, and John Dean III, personal counselor to President Nixon.
Every day, the trail drew nearer to the White House.
The plan kept evolving as the problems evolved. There was no one person who was going to take the rap. There were several people. You know, initially it was thought, well, you know, we'll stop it at Liddy, then we'll stop it at Magruder, then we'll stop it at Mitchell. Then as it started coming over to the White House, then we'll stop it at Dean. And then the president decided, I'll stop it at Haldeman and Ehrlichman.
It finally got to the point where Bill Rogers and Kissinger and one or two others advised Nixon strongly that we were liabilities. We were getting beat up in the press every day. These accusations were hanging over our heads. And so he decided to fire us.
The president was becoming ever more isolated as his closest aides moved from the White House to the committee rooms and the courtrooms.
John W. Dean III went before the Senate Watergate Committee today and, as expected, gave the committee names, dates, and places involved in the Watergate affair and its cover-up. Included among those names of the names of those having knowledge of the cover-up was Dean's former boss, the President of the United States.
The story had the town by the throat. When it got to the Urban hearings, you could leave your office and take a cab to the Senate or the House, and you wouldn't miss a word. I mean, it was on radios all down the corridor or television as you left your own building. It was on radio in the cabs, and it was on the open doors of the Senate office buildings, and you know, on the desks of the guards. It was everywhere.
July 16th, the unbelievable revelation at the Senate hearings. Everything the president and anyone else had said in the Oval Office had been taped secretly by the president himself. There was now a new issue at the center of the Watergate story. Would the president release the tapes? He refused, claiming executive privilege.
This is a rather remarkable letter about the tapes. If you notice, the president says he's heard the tapes, or some of them, and they sustain his position. But he says he's not going to let anybody else hear them for fear they might draw a different conclusion.
This principle of confidentiality of presidential conversations is at stake in the question of these tapes. I must and I shall oppose any efforts to destroy this principle, which is so vital to the conduct of this great office.
Archibald Cox, the Watergate special prosecutor, had refused to accept merely a synopsis of the tapes. On Saturday, October 20th, the president ordered his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox. Richardson refused and resigned.
President Nixon had to reach down to the number 3 man in the Justice Department, the Solicitor General, Robert Bork, before finding someone willing to obey his order to fire Archibald Cox.
In the wake of what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, the president's impeachment was no longer unimaginable. Stunned by the fury of the public's response, the White House agreed on October 30th to turn over the subpoenaed tapes to Judge John Sirica, but 2 of them were missing. On November 21st, another startling revelation.
On the day the prosecution suspects the Watergate cover-up began, the crucial conversations between the president and his chief aides are missing or partially obliterated.
Those tapes, which do remain, were finally put in the custody of the court this afternoon, a month after the White House first agreed to honor the subpoena.
For the president, the news just kept getting worse.
By an overwhelming vote of 410 to 4, the House of Representatives today gave its Judiciary Committee unqualified powers for an investigation to determine if there are sufficient grounds to impeach President Nixon.
On April 30th, 1974, the president made public transcripts of some of the tapes, which he had edited heavily. They were an instant bestseller, and to many readers, they showed a man capable of more mean-spiritedness, pettiness, and even bigotry than they assumed could ever inhabit the keeper of the Oval Office. And the passages he'd excised, and his frequent use of the words expletive deleted, only fired any reader's imagination, not to his advantage.
I think the tapes give you instead of a truthful impression of Nixon, a warped one. Because he was not the same person to Chuck Colson as he was to Arthur Burns. He wasn't the same to Pat Buchanan as he was to me. Now, perhaps this is a fault. At the same time, it's a complexity.
As spring turned to summer and the legal wrangling continued, 2 trips now brought back images of the foreign policy president, even if they didn't succeed in pushing Watergate off the front page. In Egypt, the president's meeting with President Anwar Sadat was a step towards the Camp David Accords with Israel 5 years later. A summit in Moscow in early July was less successful. The meeting with Leonid Brezhnev reinforced détente, but failed to achieve a new arms agreement. Back home, the Watergate endgame was beginning.
The Supreme Court rules unanimously that President Nixon must turn over subpoenaed material to Watergate prosecutor Jaworski. In San Clemente, President Nixon is preparing his response to the court's order.
And one of the new tapes became known as the smoking gun because it showed how soon after the Watergate break-in arrests in 1972, the president was directing the cover-up in spite of the urging of some of his aides.
I told Richard Nixon, look, find out whoever was involved in this thing, expose them and cut your losses and get out of it. Little did I know at that point that he really thought Mitchell was involved, and he wasn't about to turn on Mitchell. So the ultimate drama of Watergate and the great national tragedy turned on something as simple and human as Richard Nixon not wanting to turn one of his friends in.
Too loyal to Mitchell, he let Mitchell go. He let them all go. They all went to prison. And as the boat sank, he threw them out one at a time. To argue that Dick Nixon went down because he was too loyal is just ridiculous. Ehrlichman goes, Haldeman goes, Dean goes, Mitchell goes, everybody but Dick goes. And then he's out there in that boat all by himself. There's a storm coming at him, and he's trying to figure out what his options are.
The thing that's so appalling to me is that the president, when this whole idea was suggested to him, didn't in righteous indignation rise up and say, get out of here, you're in the office of the President of the United States. How can you talk about blackmail and bribery and keeping witnesses silent?
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Aye.
On July 27th, the House Judiciary Committee approved the first article of impeachment. Within 3 days, it had approved 2 more.
Aye. No. No. No.
Mr. Rodino. Aye.
Before impeachment proceedings moved to the full House, the president made a final, inevitable decision. Richard Nixon had been trying to extinguish the growing flames of Watergate since before his second term had begun. Now, in early August of 1974, a year and a half later, the struggle was nearly over. Richard Nixon understood that he did not have the support in Congress to stop the impeachment process from grinding onwards. He knew he would have to go, and now he began to make his goodbyes. His family argued with him, urging him to fight, but he held firm. Still, the master politician, he knew the numbers and the political mood were against him. The family spent a final evening together in the White House on August 7th.
My father had called White House photographer Ollie Atkins up to the solarium where we'd just finished supper because he wanted a picture for history's sake. And we all linked arms and stood there and smiled. But my mother just hates that picture because she said there our hearts were breaking and we're smiling.
Thursday, August 8th, was spent making final arrangements. And then, at 9:01 p.m., Richard Nixon made his last speech as President of the United States.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
I was in prison, and I was watching his resignation on a little black and white television set, feeling, first of all, a tremendous sadness for him, personally. I liked Richard Nixon. I admired Richard Nixon. I respected Richard Nixon, and he was my friend. And I saw the country that I loved and had served as a Marine Corps captain and 4 years in the White House torn apart. So it was a very dismal moment. And I was looking at a possible 3 years in prison. So it was not one of the happier days of my life.
Charles Colson would end up serving 7 months. John Ehrlichman would serve 18 months. Bob Haldeman would serve 18 months. John Mitchell would serve 19 months. And John Dean would serve 5 months. On the day of the resignation, Friday, August 9th, Richard Nixon made his farewell to the White House staff.
The farewell speech to the staff, it was very difficult because he was really letting down his guard for one of the few times in public. I mean, just from not only the cosmetic point of wearing the glasses, but his voice cracking with emotion as he spoke about a man is not defeated until he gives up. You have to keep going in life, keep fighting. And it was difficult.
And so we leave with high hopes, in good spirit, and with deep humility, and with very much gratefulness in our hearts.
Then his final goodbye. It's how many will always remember him.
Who knows what to say about Nixon in those last moments. I mean, what the hell was going on there? He's given the V for victory, and he's hunched over, and he's so quintessentially Nixon, and he's got that phony smile on his face. And who knows what to make about that? And it takes Shakespeare to describe this kind of a scene. It's beyond my powers as a writer.
At Andrews Air Force Base, he and Pat would transfer to Air Force One for the journey home to California, to the house by the Pacific at San Clemente. Then, in a surprise announcement, just 1 month after the resignation, Gerald Ford granted a pardon to Richard Nixon.
A full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
It was a bitter pill for many Americans, and there were immediate charges that a deal had been struck. Resignation in return for a pardon. It wasn't true, but many would say it's what cost Gerald Ford the election 2 years later. Now, life in the beautiful San Clemente house, in the spectacular setting, still with a staff of 22, settled into a period of surreal calm.
No.